Airbus new flow patterns and checklist. A320, Mentor channel. Cockpit preparation. Checklist trigger, departure briefing completed. Gear pins and covers, removed. The pilot flying confirms that the gear pins and covers were checked removed during the walk-around. The pilot flying announces removed. Fuel quantity. Kilograms. The pilot flying checks the fuel on board and fuel distribution on the fuel system display page and compares it with the computerized flight plan. The pilot flying announces 9,900 kilograms balanced. Seat belts. On. The pilot flying checks the memo. The pilot flying announces on. Adders. Nav. The pilot flying checks on the MCDU that the adders are on nav. The pilot flying announces nav. Baro ref, both. The pilot flying and pilot monitor check and read the QNH baro setting, or QFE baro setting. The pilot flying then pilot monitor announces QNH 1013. Before start. Checklist trigger, pushback clearance or start clearance received. Before start flow pattern completed. Beacon, on. Windows, check closed. Doors slides, check closed armed. Thrust levers. Idle. Park brake handle, on. ATC. Set for operations. Windows, check closed. Doors slides, check closed armed. Before start. Checklist trigger, pushback clearance or start clearance received before start flow pattern completed. Parking brake. Set. The PF checks the park brake memo. The PF announces set. Takeoff speeds and thrust. Both. The PF reads aloud V1, VR, V2 and thrust setting on the FMS performance page while PM checks V1 and V2 on the PFD. The PF announces V1. 125, VR 125, V2 129, Flex 52. The PM reads aloud V1, VR, V2 and thrust setting on the FMS performance page while PF checks V1 and V2 on the PFD. The PM announces V1. 125, VR 125, V2 129, Flex 52. Beacon. On. The PF checks the beacon switch on the overhead panel. The PF announces on. Windows closed, both. Normal start sequence. Engine mode selector norm. APU bleed push button switch off. Anti-ice as required. APU master switch push button off. ECAM status check. Nose wheel steering disconnect memo check not displayed. Ground spoilers arm. Rudder check 0. Flaps set. Pitch trim set. ECAM status check. After start checklist. Checklist trigger, on hand signal from the ground personnel. Anti-ice. The PF checks the wing anti-ice push button and ENG12 anti-ice push button on the anti-ice overhead panel. The PF announces off or engines on wings on. ECAM status, checked. The PF checks on ECAM that the status reminder is not displayed. Pitch trim. Percent. The PF checks the pitch trim wheel is at the expected takeoff CG value. The PF announces 32.4%. Rudder trim. Neutral. The PF checks the rudder trim is within the tolerance plus or minus 0.3 degrees. The PF announces neutral. Park brake off. Brake checked. Pressure 0. Flight controls check. Full up. Full down. Neutral. Full left. Full right. Neutral. Rudder. Full left. Full right. Neutral. Taxi flow pattern. Auto brake max push button switch on. Squawk confirm set. Engine mode selector as required. Radar PWS on auto. Takeoff configuration push button test. Takeoff memo check no blue. Taxi. Checklist trigger, takeoff configuration push button pressed and cabin report received. Flight controls. Checked, both. The PF confirms that the flight controls check was performed. The PF then PM announces checked. Flaps setting, configuration 1, both the PF and the PM check and compare the flaps setting on the engine warning display and FMS performance page. The PF and the PM announces the configuration displayed on engine warning display, conference 1 plus F. Radar and predictive wind shear. On and auto. The PF checks on the ND that the weather radar is on. The PF checks on the pedestal that the predictive wind shear is auto. The PF announces on and auto. Engine mode cell. Norm. The PF checks the ignition is displayed or not on the memo. The PF announces ignition or norm. ECAM memo, takeoff no blue. Auto brake max. Seat belts on. Cabin ready. Spoilers arm. Flaps takeoff. Takeoff config norm. The PF checks no blue items on the ECAM memo. The PF announces takeoff no blue. Lineup checklist trigger, lineup clearance received before takeoff flow pattern completed. Takeoff runway. Confirm. Approach path. Clear of traffic. Exterior lights. Set. TCAS mode selector. TA only or TARA. Takeoff runway. Confirm. Approach path. Clear of traffic. Packs 1 and 2. As required. Cabin crew, advise. Line up. Checklist. Takeoff runway. 25 left confirmed. Both. TCAS, TARA. Packs 1 and 2. On. Departure change. Checklist trigger, revised departure briefing completed. Runway and standard instrument departure. Cadence 1 Foxtrot. The PF checks the runway, the shift, and the standard instrument departure on the FMS. The PF announces runway 25 left, shift 0 meters in standard instrument departure Cadence 1 Fox. Flaps setting, conference 1 plus F, both the PF checks and compares the flaps setting on the PFD and FMS perf page. The PF announces the configuration displayed on PFD conference 1 plus F. Takeoff speeds and thrust. Both the PF reads allowed V1, VR, V2 and thrust setting on the FMS perf page while PM checks V1 and V2 on the PFD. The PF announces V1 125, VR 125, V2 129, flex 52. The PM reads allowed V1, VR, V2 and thrust setting on the FMS perf page while PF checks V1 and V2 on the PFD. The PM announces V1 125, VR 125, V2 129, flex 52. FCU altitude. The PF checks the altitude on the glare shield. The PF announces 5,000 feet. Now let's see the acceleration flow after takeoff. Flaps 0. Select. Ground spoilers. Disarm. Landing gear. Check up. Exterior lights. Set. At 10,000 feet above aerodrome level flow pattern. FE's option push button, constrain, ILS push button, as required. Nav aids nav accuracy as required monitor. Landing lights. On. Seat belts. On. FE's option push button, constrain, ILS push button, as required. Engine mode selector. As required. Approach. Checklist trigger, below 10,000 feet above aerodrome level and barometric reference set. Baro ref. Both the PF and PM check and read the QNH baro setting, or QFE baro setting. The PF then PM announce. QNH 1013, seatbelts. On. The PF checks the memo. The PF announces on. Minimum. The PF checks the baro or radio minimum on the FMA. The PF announces. Baro 351 feet or radio 351 feet. Auto brake. The PF checks the auto brake mode on the auto brake panel. The PF announces the auto brake mode. Low or mid. Engine mode cell. The PF checks that ignition is displayed or not on the memo. The PF announces ignition or norm. Landing. Checklist trigger, landing configuration set and cabin report received. ECAM memo. Landing no blue. Landing gear down. Seat belts on. Cabin ready. Spoilers arm. Flaps full or conference 3. The PF checks no blue items on the ECAM memo. The PF announces landing no blue. Cabin ready. The PF confirms that the cabin report is received. The PF announces ready. Landing checklist. ECAM memo. Landing no blue.
400, 100 above. Minimum.
In case of go around as per his acceleration flow pattern.
200. 100. 50. 40. 30. 20. Retard 10. 5.
After landing flow pattern. Ground spoilers. Disarm. Exterior lights. Set. Radar, predictive wind shear system, off. Engine mode selector, norm. Flaps, retract. TCAS ATC, standby as required. APU, start. Anti-ice as required. After landing. Checklist trigger, after landing flow pattern completed. Radar and predictive wind shear system, off. The PF checks on the pedestal that the weather radar and predictive wind shear are off. The PF announces off. Parking flow pattern. Accumulator press check. Parking brake handle. On. All engines masters levers. Off. Exterior lights. Off. Slides. Check disarmed. Seat belt switch, off. Anti-ice, off. APU bleed push button switch, on. Fuel pumps, off. Parking. Checklist trigger, seat belt switch off. Parking brake or chocks, set. The PF checks the park BRK memo or confirms that the ground personnel set the chocks. The PF announces parking brake set or chocks set. Engines. Off. The PF checks the master levers and engine parameters on EWD. The PF announces off. Wing lights, off. The PF checks the wing lights push button switch on the EXT-LT overhead panel. The PF announces off. Fuel pumps. Off. The PF checks the fuel push button switch on the overhead panel. The PF announces off. Securing the aircraft. Checklist trigger, after the last passenger left the aircraft, if securing the aircraft is intended. Oxygen, off. The CM2 checks the crew supply push button switch on the oxygen overhead panel. The CM2 announces off. EMER exit light, off. The CM2 checks the EMER exit LT switch on the signs overhead panel. The CM2 announces off. EFBs, off. The CM1 and CM2 check the EFBs. The CM1 then CM2 announces off. Batteries, off. The CM1 checks the BAT push button switch on the ELEC overhead panel. The CM1 announces off. A320, Mentor Channel.